As someone who's hit Challenger, one of the most frequent questions I get asked is how do you just get better at the game? While I focus a lot on specific concepts, there's also some more general guidelines and principles that'll help you get better at the game. And I think that the most important thing is that you have the right mentality, because you can go in and play a huge number of games, and while experience and gaining experience is important, if you play a huge number of games but you don't have the right mentality, you'll waste a lot of your time, because you have to be looking for your mistakes, focusing on yourself, and figuring out what it is that you can do better. There is a misconception, though, I think, that because people will like focus on their teammates or sometimes get frustrated with their teammates, that that's not productive. And I'm here to tell you, probably the only one with this take, that actually focusing on your teammates' mistakes, if it's not to the exclusion of focusing on your own mistakes, can actually be fine. Because if you see what everyone in your elo is doing wrong, and you're willing to admit that, hey, I see my teammates making these mistakes and they're terrible, but I make the same mistakes, and then you recognize and learn from your teammates' mistakes, it's actually better to learn from both your mistakes and your teammates' mistakes than to only learn from your mistakes. So it's fine to have that, competitive spirit and to be frustrated at your teammates and recognize what they're doing wrong. But if you do that to the exclusion of focusing on your own mistakes, that's a problem. And a lot of people have that, which is why people say you shouldn't focus on your teammates' mistakes at all. But if you can learn from their mistakes as well, just like, in life, you see somebody make a dumb decision, face negative consequences, obviously you can do the same thing with League. So I think that's a big misconception as well. But you have to be able to look for your own mistakes, accept responsibility and accountability, recognize that if you were better, you would be winning these games, and that there's a lot that you can do. Number two, this is really important to how you go about learning the game, is you have to be limit testing, right? Especially in the beginning, especially if you're a lower rank, you have to be fighting a lot, because while League is actually quite a passive game, and you'll often do better in the short term if you play very passively, you won't learn how to play your champion by playing like that. And so if you're like very low rank, unless you're like maybe Masters plus, maybe even in Masters, you have to be limit testing, because if you're not ever going to figure out like what the limits of your champion are, how much damage you take, how much damage you can really deal, whether you really win this matchup or lose this matchup. You just won't collect as much information as somebody who's fighting all the time. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but it is how it works. You have to fight in order to learn the game. You have to use your abilities frequently in order to learn their range and to be comfortable using them. But then the contradiction is that later on, once you're very good at using them, and there's not much room for you to get better at using them, you need to be smarter and more conservative with how you use your abilities and with when you decide to fight. And so I think in the beginning, you have to play a very proactive game. You have to try a lot of things to learn. You're going to die a lot. You're going to fail a lot. You're going to feed a lot. That's why it's called limit testing. Whenever I play a new champion or a new role, I often play extremely aggressively and die 10 plus times every single game. And I can flip a switch and play passively and do quite well and not die that much. But I wouldn't be learning nearly as much. I'm learning, many multiples times less than if I'm fighting all the time. But that is difficult, because that's one of the things that I had to overcome before I hit Challenger. Was I had built up all these aggressive habits as a player. And those habits were what made me good in the first place, because they allowed me to fight so much and gain so much experience from the time that I had put in, that I was able to get very, very good at the game. But it was a hard habit to break later on, because even if you are limit testing, it could still take you many years to get good at the game. And then you're going to have to break a multi-year habit about the way that you play the game in order to play the game properly later on. So that's difficult. But I do believe that the best way to get better at the game is to fight, and limit test, especially if you're lower rank or on a new champion. Number three, champion pool discipline. So obviously this is really important, but I want you to think about it in terms of the last piece of advice that I gave, which was that you're limit testing. And what you're gaining out of limit testing is learning what matchups you win and what matchups you lose, learning how much damage you deal, how much damage you take, and kind of pushing your mechanics. and you're learning key concepts and stuff like that. Well, the thing is that when you're playing one champion, that all applies to that one champion. But if you're playing 10 or 20 different champions, you're trying to do that simultaneously like 10 or 20 times. So the damage that you take, the damage that you do, the concepts that make you good at the characters that you're playing may be totally different. You may even be playing multiple roles. Everything that you're trying to accomplish by playing aggressively in the first place and trying to get very good at your champion is just going to be greatly diminished by trying to learn multiple things at the same time, because you're already like trying to learn the game, trying to figure things out, and now you're just making it like multiple times harder for yourself because you're trying to do it on so many different champions at the same time. So it's not just about, oh, it's easier to climb if you play one champion. It's easier to get better at the game because you're constantly reinforcing what you're learning and you're constantly getting to challenge yourself on the same champion. So everything that you're learning and taking away from that game applies the next game. Whereas if you learn, you spend 10 hours learning one champion and then you spend 10 hours learning another champion, you're going to have some crossover. Of course, it's the same game, but not a lot is going to apply. And champions can play really, really differently. Like, to be honest, playing, Braum support and playing Singed top, it's like playing two totally different games. There's like, very little overlap between the two. And even when a good player, goes from one champion or one role and then starts learning another champion or another role, was that player instantly good at that other role that they started playing because of what they already knew about the game? Or did they have to go through a learning process and relearn everything that they learned about the game from the view of that champion? That's what happens, is like these players who are really good and then switch roles or switch champions, they know how to learn, but it's more about them knowing how to get better at the game than it is about them knowing how to play the game on that champion instantly the minute they pick it up, because they will have some really rough games even in really low ranks until they understand some basics about the champion. And so we see that all the time. So obviously sticking to one champion is the most efficient way to climb. People worry about like team comps and counter picks and stuff like that. It really doesn't matter in solo queue. All the time, right? I play against champions that should counter me. We can even go like to my op.gg and look really quickly, and I'll tell you that you can see very clearly that even in a counter matchup, like I play a lot of Braum. If we go to like Braum versus Lulu, like this is the matchup that I've played the most. But I'm 14-10 versus Lulu. So the idea that just because I'm in a rough matchup means that I'm guaranteed to lose the game, I just think is like not really accurate. So, we can go to like look at some past data as well. I'm like 10-5 versus Karma last split, so 9-5 versus Nami, which shouldn't be great for Braum, 9-2 versus Janna. So the thing is that counter matchups in solo queue just don't matter a whole lot, because oftentimes if they're trying to counter pick you, unless they're just really lucky and they genuinely main the champion that counters you, they're going to actually get baited into playing a champion that they're way less comfortable with. Like, they'll pick a champion they have 10 games of experience on, and you're playing a champion that you have hundreds of games of experience on or thousands of games of experience on. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think that a counter pick is going to make up for a player being literally like 1,000 times more experienced on their champion than somebody else, and who's played that counter matchup, even though it's counter matchup, hundreds of times, because the matchup you're going to play the most is your counter matchups? So in solo queue, even at a high level, and it should matter even less at lower ranks, picking a champion, that fits into your team comp, or worrying about it getting countered or something like that, just doesn't matter a whole lot in solo queue. Now, it's important to understand drafting and to understand, oh, this champion fits into this team comp here and why. But at the end of the day in solo queue, like, look, rank 1 players all the time are one tricks. Like you had Riven one trick, who's rank 1, right? Viper here in NA. So, I got to challenger one tricking Braum for the most part. I have a lot of experience on other champions from the past, but, focusing up on just one champion really helped me a lot. So I would say, if you can, stick to just your favorite champion in your main role. If you feel like you need to be able to play multiple champions, what other good players, even who aren't one tricks, do is they will only play 3 champions at a time in Challenger. So they recognize that experience gap is too important to be picking their 10th best champion or their 20th best champion unless they're just practicing that champion for fun and not trying to climb. And there are plenty of people doing that because they're trying to get on teams and show that they can play many different champions and pick based on situations and practice. And that's all well and good. But if you're trying to climb seriously in solo queue, the top players in solo queue all play 1 to 3 champions. Now, they might switch out those 3 champions if the meta drastically changes, or, if one of those champions really falls out of favor or gets gutted, they might switch that one champion out, but they're never, going more than 2 weeks or like less than 2 weeks without playing the same 3 champions. And that kind of champion pool discipline will make it easier for not only for you to climb, but for you to learn, because you're focusing on learning the concepts and the damage output and the damage taken and the timing and the concepts that those champions teach you or that those champions rely on in order to play the game well. You will learn those things much quicker through those champions. The other thing is that there's a lot of stuff about League like map awareness, which is extremely important, that you just have a hard time with in low elo because you're not comfortable playing your champion. So it's not that you don't want to look at the minimap or that you're not necessarily in the habit of looking at the minimap, although that's true. It's that you never build the habit of looking at the minimap constantly, because if you were to spend 50% of your time like I do watching the minimap, you probably would not be able to pilot your champion properly. And that's just due to lack of experience. And so if you can put in the experience and the time on one champion so that you can actually watch the map, all of the sudden rotations, basic macro decisions, roaming opportunities, right? Like seeing where the enemy jungler is, all of this stuff opens up to you, and you understand and learn the actual game itself better when you do a good job of playing, just one champion. The other thing I'll say is just really quickly, as far as recommendations on champions to play, I think that if you want to play like just some very easy to play champions that I would recommend that you try out or that you play, although of course I'm always a big advocate that you should play whatever you enjoy the most, but there are certain champions that are going to be much more difficult to learn. So when people in low elo play Yasuo and Zed and stuff like that, and Yone, they're going to have a hard time. And it's going to be a lot slower for them to climb than if they play a simpler champion. Same goes with other roles. You're trying to learn a Philios ADC or whatever, you're going to have a hard time. So my recommendation for support would be play something simple like Leona. If you want to play an Enchanter, play something simple like Janna. If you want to play AD carry, play something like Ashe or Misfortune, depending on whether you want to play, kind of an attack speed reliant AD carry or a caster. And then if you want to play mid, play something like Annie, or if you want to play an assassin in mid lane really bad, something like Nefiri or Talon. That's a lot harder than it is to play a mage like Annie, but they're kind of the easiest assassins that you could play. For jungle, if you want to play, a tank, a Mumu is a great champion to play as an AP champion or a tank champion. And I guess if you wanted to play more of an AD-oriented champion in jungle, let's see, what would I recommend? Never Lee Sin, too complicated for low elo, but AD jungler. All of the good low elo junglers like Nunu, Zac, all this stuff is all AP. Good AD jungler for low elo. Maybe Jarvan? This is a little bit complicated, but not that bad. I don't really have a great AD recommendation for jungle off the top of the noggin. And then for top lane, if you want to play a tank, Malphite is great. If you want to play, more of a bruiser or fighter, AD champion, Garen is the go-to, of course. So, hopefully that helps. But obviously, you have to just experiment with many different champions and find the one that you like. If I'm telling you honestly, maybe this is true for some people, but I think that if you've tried, if you don't have a champion that you can spam 1,000 games on, you probably haven't tried all of the champions, because I think that there is a champion in this game for everyone that you could play 1,000 games on. If there's not for you, you might not enjoy League that much. I hate to say it. Maybe you should stick to 3 champions, right, to give yourself a little bit more variety. But switching champions, switching roles all the time is a killer in solo queue for sure. Number 4, question everything, especially your habits. We've talked about this before, but even when it comes to moving, auto attacking, right, and the way that you cast your abilities and all this stuff that you would think would be really basic, like the most basic things in the game, like moving and auto attacking, people don't do it properly at all. And what you really have to understand is that there's a lot of things that you're probably doing wrong that you don't even know that you're doing wrong. So it's really important to question your habits and what you've been doing for a long time, because there may be things that you just assume you've been doing right because you've been doing it that way for years and it doesn't seem to lead to any problems, but is actually an issue. So for example, when it comes to auto attacking, how do I know that you're not auto attacking properly? It's because it's actually, what if I told you that it's impossible, humanly impossible to auto attack perfectly in League? That there's an infinite skill ceiling when it comes to how you auto attack in League. I mean, I won't get into the specific concept too much, but the basics of it is that when you go to auto attack, there's a wind up animation and then a follow through animation. And so that looks different on a melee and a ranged champion, but on a melee champion, you'll, swing to punch somebody. And then there's the moment where you impact them and do damage. And then there's a follow through animation where you'll swing through or whatever. During that follow through animation where you're swinging through after you've already done the damage, your character will just stand still and not move. But if you input a movement, like a right click or whatever, you can move and cancel the second half of your auto attack, and it doesn't cost you anything or any damage because your damage has already gone through. Same thing for a ranged champion, right? The minute your projectile has left your body and is flying at them, it's already cast. So you can start moving the second you see that projectile leave. But what a lot of players do is they sit there in the follow-through animation, and so they end up spending a huge amount of time during their auto attack not moving when they could be. Good players are going to get that close to 100%. But the problem is it's not humanly possible to get 100%, because if you click to move too early before the projectile has launched or before your auto attack has hit them, if you're melee, then you'll cancel your auto attack. And so you don't want to do it. If you did it, if you tried to get it perfectly at 100%, you would often cancel your auto attack because half the time you'd be a little bit early, half the time you'd be just a little bit late. And so you want to aim, because this is only what's humanly possible, for 95% efficiency. So you're going to hit, and then as soon as you can, without canceling your auto attack, you're going to move. But you're going to allow for a little bit of a delay because you don't want to accidentally cancel your auto attacks over and over again. So I know, right, that a really, really good player, maybe the best AD carry in the world, is probably doing this with 97% accuracy or something like that. So they're moving 97% of the time that they can move, and they're dealing damage at 100%. It's a trade-off between how much do I want to move and how much do I want to deal damage. And if you're doing it at 100% efficiency, where you're moving the millisecond that the game allows you to move without canceling your auto attack, then you'd be at 100% damage and 100% movement. But that's not humanly possible. So you're going to be, obviously, if you cancel your auto attack, you go from 100% damage to 0% damage. There's no in between where you're doing like 97% of the damage. So you need 100% of the damage, but then, 90% of the movement or whatever. So I can tell you already that a lot of low elo players, right, obviously don't even know that and aren't trying to maximize the amount of time that they're moving between their auto attacks. And not only between their auto attacks, or the follow through animation, but also between their auto attacks as well. So, you could just stand still. If the person's still in your range, you could just stand still and hit them. But you can spend nearly a full second moving between your auto attack when your auto attack's on cooldown. Right? You can spend nearly a full second moving and then auto attack them and use that movement to either kite backwards to give yourself extra safety and take less damage, or kite forward, or which is called ore blocking, to chase them down and be able to deal damage to them. So this was just an example, but the concept is that if you're not even understanding how auto attacking works in the game, one of the most basic things that every champion does, then you probably are doing pretty much everything wrong when you're low elo, like literally everything. I used to put it like this: if I gave a low elo player two options for a decision that they could make, and one of them was the correct or like best option in my opinion in that situation, and one of them was like wrong, even if they were flipping a coin to pick which option, they would be better than a low elo player. Like, they're worse than flipping a coin, because there's actually like a million different things that you could do, and only a couple of them are like pretty good. And low elo players are often choosing all of the wrong options. And so I'm telling you that if you're in like a lower rank, nearly everything that you're doing about the way that you play the game is wrong in some way. You're moving wrong, you're auto attacking wrong. We'll try to correct all of that, obviously, but you have to question everything, because even things that you have been doing for years, you're probably doing wrong. A big thing that ties into this too is people play and start playing the game for fun, and then if they start getting competitive about the game or start getting into rank, they transition into taking the game more seriously. But what they don't realize subconsciously, it's that you have a lot of habits that carried over from when you were playing the game for fun. And so you think that you're playing the game to win, and you are, and you think that the decisions that you're making and things that you're doing are in your best interest to win. But what you don't realize is there's a lot of habits left over from when you were playing the game for fun that have now carried over. For example, is it more fun when you first start playing League to use your abilities a lot? Of course, it's more fun, right? This is why URF is fun, because you can do stuff all the time. It's, the problem is that in real competitive League, you don't want to use your abilities very often, because you need to hold them for key situations and key moments. So it's actually bad to use your abilities a lot. Except we talked about this earlier. If you're learning the game and you recognize that that's not the right way to play the game, that's fine. But just as an example, there are habits like using your abilities a lot or frequently, or trying to play, a certain way, trying to play aggressively. I think these things are good for learning, but these are habits that you've essentially carried over from having played for fun that, now maybe aren't so useful. Or for example, like when you first learn the game, there's a lot of misconceptions when you first learn the game that you're taught. You think that League is all about pushing minion waves into turrets and hitting turrets over and over again. That's how you win the game, is you push the turrets. So you think that pushing is good. Always taking space and pushing is always the right thing to do. It's always good, because you want to do, even if you're barely doing any damage to their turret, you want to slowly chip away at their turrets. But that's not really true, right? League is much more about your team and your champion getting stronger than your opponent. And the way to do that isn't always to constantly push. In fact, constantly pushing will get you killed a lot of the time to ganks and stuff like that. So when you carry over habits like pushing means that I'm winning, because pushing is fun, it means that I'm in control, the other guy can't push as hard as I can or do anything back, so it feels like I'm winning. Well, it feels like you're winning in that moment, But then when you get killed and your wave gets frozen, or you just get killed to a gank in general, right, you're not winning anymore. And so overextending yourself by pushing all the time, or trying to take towers that you can't, or overstaying after you kill the enemy team and trying to push for more than you can because you're getting greedy and you want more and you want to feel like you're winning more. Doing these things are all bad habits that you carried over from when you first started playing the game. Another bad habit is obviously like taking inhibitors and stuff like that. Just think about the math. Just think about the math. When you kill an enemy inhibitor, you spawn a super minion that gives the enemy team 90 gold per wave. That's 90 gold every 30 seconds. And it gives them a bunch of XP. And it's killing the enemy minion wave so that you can't CS it, because unless you're ahead of that minion, and you're not always going to be the entire time the inhibitor is down, you're going to constantly reduce the amount of gold that your team is getting from their minion waves in that lane permanently. So when you take an inhibitor, you're giving maybe 90 gold to the enemy team, and let's say that you're denying yourself let's see, how much is a wave worth, right? You've got about 20 on the melee minions, you got about 15 or 16, it depends on the level and stuff like that, but you got about, let's call it, especially by the time you're taking an inhib, let's just call it like 16 or so on the range minion. Actually, I'll call it 15 so the math's easier. 20 on the melees, so you're looking at 60 on the melees and then 45. So that would be 105, and then cannon waves start spawning over and over again every wave. So if you're losing a cannon as well, support, by the way, I don't even know how much a cannon's worth. It's got to be like 50 or so. It also depends on the time, right? But let's call the cannon 50. So if you're losing like 150 gold, if you were to lose the whole wave, let's call it half of that because you're going to get the CS sometimes. Let's say that you're losing 75 gold a wave plus some experience, and they're gaining 90 gold a wave plus some experience. That's like 140 gold per wave that is swinging because you took their inhibitor. And so they're gaining a net of 140 gold plus some experience, and some experience denied to your team because you took the inhibitor. So you have to get a kill every minute, right? 300 gold every minute that inhibitor is down to make up for you taking that inhibitor. So you better bet that the only time it's worth it to take an inhibitor is if you are actually guaranteed to get some kind of huge pressure off of that inhibitor being down, and it guarantees you a Baron, or it guarantees you a Dragon, or it guarantees you a Dragon Soul or something like that, or Elder or Otacon. You better be getting something very powerful for it. And that's why the middle inhibitor is even worse, because the middle inhibitor threatens their Nexus turrets much less than the outer inhibitors, where the wave isn't getting hit by as many turret shots on the outer inhibitors, and it can actually threaten to take a Nexus turret if they don't respond, and it can be on the opposite side of the map to the objective you're taking. So if you are wanting to get Baron, their bottom inhibitor is great. If you're wanting to get a Dragon or something like that, their top inhibitor is great. Things like that. So essentially, what you have to understand is that taking inhibitors is usually pretty bad unless you're going to end the game off of taking the inhibitor or get some very powerful objective that's worth the gold trade-off. The other thing that you have to understand is that taking 3 inhibitors is much stronger, because when you get 1 inhibitor, it spawns 1 super minion per wave, but when you kill all 3, it spawns 2 super minions in every wave. So getting all 3 at the same time is much more powerful than just getting 1, or taking 1 early and then getting another later, but now their respawn timers are off, and so they always have 1 up. And so one of the other bad things about taking an inhibitor, especially early like that, is that you actually deny yourself time to have all 3 of their inhibitors down, because you can't take it again if it's already down. So now you only get 30 seconds or 1 minute of double super minions because you took that other one too early, not at the same time as you could take all the other ones. So if it's too early in the game, like 17, 18, 19 minutes, and you're not about to end the game, taking an inhibitor is really, really bad. The other thing is that even in terms of like having to get through one less structure to end the game, your team, if you wipe the enemy team after winning a team fight, will blow through like a 3000 damager inhibitor so fast that it won't slow you down when you're trying to end the game almost at all. Think about how long it takes you to take an inhibitor in the late game when you're ending the game. It takes a couple of seconds and then you're through. It's really, most of the time, not going to make a difference. So taking inhibitors is really, really bad when you start thinking about it, thinking about what it actually does, what it actually gives, and the math behind it. Yet we're ingrained, because of what we learned when we first started playing the game, that, oh, you're supposed to push and destroy the enemy team's base. We just think that we should be rewarded for whatever we can manage to take, and so we're just habitually taking these things for fun when we haven't even consciously thought for 10 years about what an inhibitor does. I mean, it's like people have known that inhibitors are bad for a while, but even at like a very high level, even in the professional level, how recently did teams start really trying not to take inhibitors? Maybe 5 years ago max. This was like, a big topic of conversation. So it took 10 years for the players at the top of the game to even think about inhibitors and realize that they were bad to take most of the time. So think about that. There are habits, there are things that you assume, that you take for granted, that you've known about League for years, that are just wrong, and the opposite is true. You just haven't gotten to thinking about it yet because you're focused on what you're doing with your champion. And so you haven't even pushed the boundaries of what's possible there with the game. Okay, number 5, time. Obviously, like League's a complicated game. There's a huge amount to learn. And so you cannot just simply flip a switch or learn one thing and get better at the game instantly. It takes a huge amount of time in order to get better at the game. And that's just a reality, right? For me, it took about 10,000 ranked games to get to Challenger. That's probably slower than normal because I think that if you had PC gaming experience before you played League and then you came to League, you could progress much quicker in the beginning. And so you may be able to do it much faster than that. Obviously, certain prodigy players who are just like understand the game intuitively very well and don't have to grind as much in order to get better at the game. Obviously, those players can manage to improve much quicker than that, maybe in 3,000 games in a couple of years. But those players are prodigies. So understand that even for the best, most gifted players coming in with PC gaming experience and intuitively understand the game very well, really the minimum amount of time that it takes to get Challenger from not ever having played League before is going to be like 3,000 games, which is a lot, right? It's like 3,000 hours. So don't expect anything like that to happen. Be reasonable with your goals and assumptions about how long it's going to take you to get to a certain level. And not everyone's trying to get to Challenger, but even if you're trying to get to Diamond or Emerald or Platinum or whatever your goal is, or just get to Gold, right? Those things take time. When I first tried to get to Gold, I think I probably played 1,500 games, 2,000 games before I hit Gold for the first time. Again, that was probably slower than average because I had never played on a PC before, and I had never used a mouse and keyboard before. I started playing League on a trackpad. I played ranked games on a trackpad on a laptop with 2 gigabytes of RAM, a Mac laptop with 2 gigabytes of RAM. So obviously, if you're in that sort of situation, if you have like super low FPS and a terrible computer and you've never played a PC game before, obviously for someone like that, like me, it's going to take a little longer. But even if, you hopefully have a better setup than that going for you, it's going to take time, right? It's going to take, depending on what your goal is, it's going to take time. And so recognize that for a new player, even if you're really gifted at the game, it's probably going to take you, a couple hundred games maybe to get Gold. Like 100, 200, 300 games to get Gold for the first time is pretty reasonable. Other thing I'll say in defense of myself back then is that Gold today is not equivalent to Gold back then. It's just not. You can look at the rank distribution numbers and stuff like that. There are way more players in Gold and in Platinum and in Emerald today than there were back in season 2, season 3. So that is kind of different as well. So it's hard to equate that exactly. Getting gold today is probably the equivalent of, or like getting gold back then is probably the equivalent today in terms of the rank distribution of hitting like platinum. So, it probably was more accurate to say it took me like 1,500 games to get to platinum for the first time with no PC gaming experience, no mouse and keyboard experience. So, that's not too bad. And then number 3, just briefly on some fundamentals, or like what I think you should focus on learning the most. Obviously, I've said it before, but if you're going to play this game and play it well, you've got to know what all the abilities in the game are, what all of the items in the game are. But that is a daunting task because there's like 800 abilities in the game at least. And there's a bunch more items. You're not going to learn them all, but learn the common ones. So for example, right, let's go back to op.gg for a second here. If we go back to op.gg and we take a look at, let's go to champions. If we go to pick rate, and let's say we're trying to learn support, you do not need to learn all 4 or 5 abilities, if you include the passive and whatnot, for all 46 champions that are listed here. I mean, eventually you will, right? But start smart, start efficiently, learn what Lulu does, learn what Nami does, learn what Karma does, because these are the most picked champions. You can even adjust this and go to your rank, right? So like, go to gold. These are the most picked supports in gold, right? I'm going to learn the top 10 or make sure that I know the top 10. Maybe, of course, you already know most of them. So you say, okay, I already know exactly what Lux does, exactly what Nami does. I'm a little bit confused about how Lulu W works, or I'm a little bit confused about how Nami passive works. I don't really know. Or I don't know how Senna works. She's a little bit newer and I haven't seen her as much, right? So just start on the top of the list of the most picked champions in the game, right? If you're wanting to learn all the champions, obviously, like for support, you're going to have to learn 80 carries as well. 80 carries, you're going to have to learn support as well. In general, you're going to want to know against all of them, including when you get out of lane, but your lane's the most important part. So just do it in a smart way. So start with the top 10 champions in your role, then move on to the role that's most related to you. So if it's like mid lane, you're learning the jungle champions as well. If you're bot lane, you're learning the support champions as well. If you're support, you're learning the bot champions as well. And then eventually branch out to, all of the champions and just know like your lane opponents first. And then maybe, the top 20 or 30 most played champions in the game in general. And all of the sudden, you can take a game where you need to learn 160 different champions and 800 different abilities, and you can shrink it down to a manageable size of, okay, today I'm going to learn these 3 champions in my role. Just look at the Wikipedia real quick, watch the champion spotlight, learn some basics about how they work. Just make it manageable and go in order. This is the order that you want to learn them in so that you're going about this in an efficient way. And, you may think to yourself, like, this is like very low elo advice. This is for people who are just starting the game. It's not, right? I don't know. I'm telling you, I hit Challenger. I still don't know. And I've been playing the game for 15 years or whatever, 13 years or 12 years. There are a lot of champions, especially if you're a more veteran player like I am, that have been changed over the years, and you don't remember all of the details about how they've been changed because you missed the patch notes one week, or you read it one time and forgot about it, or forgot a detail about it. Like, it's just inevitable that there are going to be many champions that were new that got released that you never fully learned, that were reworked or got some sort of update to the way their abilities work that you just weren't able to keep up with, or you forgot a few details from. There are probably lots of important details, even as a veteran player, that you don't remember. And so you should still go through this as a veteran player. Like, I realized when I started learning a little bit about playing top lane and looking at some of these champions and kind of thinking about this order myself, that I don't really know the specific details about a lot of what's changed with top lane champions and stuff like that, because I interact with them the least, right? So for me, it was about expanding my knowledge of top lane because it's the role I interact with the least, and realizing that, like, oh, Garen can cleanse slows now on his Q, or, he gets tenacity when he uses his W shield. These things didn't used to be the case on Garen, and so a couple of years ago, when I learned how they worked for the first time, it changed my perspective on the champion. Same thing with like, oh, well, set W is true damage, and that blows through Braum. His shield does not block it at all because it's true damage. So I was getting, hit for a lot of damage by set, thinking I could just E the damage. Had to learn that that was the case. I didn't know that, like Darius could. I didn't understand how applying his passive to other people worked in a team fight. Where if he gets to 5 stacks on one person, if he hits another person with an auto attack or any ability, he instantly applies all 5 stacks to them. So if you're playing against a Darius in a team fight, even if he's not necessarily a huge threat to you, or you think that you're tanking or getting him to focus you or something like that, you shouldn't let him hit you and stack up to 5 stacks on you, because it's very bad for your team, because he'll start applying it to the rest of your team and killing everyone. So that's very important to know, right? As like a melee tank support, that I don't want to let Darius auto attack me at all. All of these little details about how these champions work. Sometimes, like I could have told you for 10 years what all of Darius's abilities are in general. But a lot of times, just because that Darius's Q is a circle that spins around him and deals damage and heals him, doesn't mean that you know everything that you need to know about Darius Q. There's so many more little details that really affect the way that you play around it. Like, for example, that his Q is going to apply his passive stacks to other people. So if you see that Darius has stacked up a bunch of stacks on somebody else, getting hit with his Q is way more deadly and way more, bad for you than if he hasn't gotten passive stacks yet. Or, of course, I think most people do know this one, but if you're, in the middle of Darius's Q, he doesn't get the healing from it, and he does a bunch of reduced damage. So all these little details like that you sometimes miss or forget after years after champions come out, especially if you've never played them yourself or never tried them, you will forget these details and not know it, even if you're a veteran player. So that's just kind of how it goes. So I think the fundamentals are that you have to learn what all of the champions and abilities in the game are, and items and stuff like that, but start doing it in a smart way. Don't look at it as a daunting task where you have to learn a million things. Start with the most popular champions in your role that you're playing against in lane every game, and then expand it to roles that you're interacting with the most, and then eventually get to, all roles, just the most common champions in the game in general, and then eventually you'll expand your knowledge out from there. But there's so many, it sounds like a daunting task, but there's so many champions that are being picked in 1% of games that you never see. You could go 100 ranked games without seeing a couple of different champions sometimes, and so not learning those champions and even not knowing much about the champion that you only play once or twice in those 100 games is not going to affect you too much. So making it a more manageable task and recognizing that even as a veteran player, there are details that you've forgotten and things that you don't know is very, very important. Second thing about those fundamentals is that eventually it matters not just what the abilities do, but how they interact with other champions. So I've said this a million times, right? On Braum, especially, one of the most important concepts is that you know how your E interacts with other champions. And so you recognize that, okay, there's how these abilities interact with each other as well as the abilities themselves. So for example, super basic important stuff is like, I need to know that if a Blitzcrank Qs me as Ezreal, I can E and buffer his Q and not end up getting hooked. Or same thing on Tristana. I can buffer my W and end up not getting hooked. If I'm playing Thresh versus Jarvan, when Jarvan goes to EQ, I can flay him and knock him out of his EQ so he doesn't knock anybody up. Or if I'm playing Thresh versus Zac, I can flay him when he comes in for his jump and he won't knock any of us up. So there's basic interactions like that, or on Braum, or an ults, and you just turn around and block his ram as it's coming towards him, on the slow, and boom, you've just taken Ornn's ult away. Or, against Anivia, you can use Braum E to block her stun, and it just absorbs the stun and doesn't stun him at all. Or against Bard, right? Your E will, if you're the first thing getting hit by Bard Q, then your E will absorb the projectile and you won't get stunned. However, if he hits something first, like a minion or your teammate first, and then it hits you, then you will get stunned because you didn't absorb the projectile first. You got hit with the stun second. So you have to understand these interactions because they're just as confusing and just as important as the abilities themselves. Because, right, like it would change the way that you play a fight if you didn't know that about Braum versus Ornn, or Braum ult, or not Braum ult, Braum E blocking Talia ult. Right? Like you can make her, force her to jump off of her wall early and things like that. So number one is learn the abilities in the game so you know what's going on. And number two is, and this is why it's so important to focus on one champion, focus on learning the most important interactions that your champion has with all of the other champions, especially in your role that you're going to be laning against. So let's say that you're playing versus... let's say you're playing top lane and you're playing Jax versus Gragas. Well, you've got to know that when you go to Q in onto the Gragas, as Jax, Gragas could use his E to body slam you and cancel your Q. And so, that's something that you would probably want to watch out for, and you might be careful about queuing into Gragas because he can cancel your Q with his E. Or, if you're playing Jax versus Fiora, obviously, if you, were to use your W on Fiora, then you become very vulnerable because now Jax is, free to use his E to stun you whenever he wants. Whereas, like, the mind game in the matchup is, like, if Jax pops E first, can Fiora time the W? So this is like a very complex ability interaction because it's skill based, right? Fiora can use her W whenever she wants, but Jax doesn't have to reactivate his E at a certain time either. He can reactivate it early if he wants. So, if you start using your E as Jax into Fiora and she counters it and actually blocks it at the right time, you're in a lot of trouble because you've just wasted your E and gotten stunned. And if you're the Fiora, how do you play around that and time that? So these are important things to understand in these matchups. And if you just look at the ability on their own, that's great. But if you don't know how the two interact with each other, then you're not going to get the full picture, right? Basic stuff like that, like you've just got to know. And that's really complicated. I've said it before. Unfortunately, there's 800 abilities in the game. Well, that means that the number of ability interactions there are in the game is 800 versus 800 other abilities. So it's 800 times 800, which is like hundreds of thousands. It's literally impossible to learn them all. Luckily, most of them are very easy to understand intuitively, like a Sivir Q versus a Caitlyn Q. There's not really any special interaction there whatsoever. So what I'm calling is special ability interactions that you have to learn, where two abilities interact in a way that causes something important to happen, or maybe even happens in a way you wouldn't expect. And so you've got to understand those in order to play your matchups properly, even if you understand what the abilities do. So I think those two things are really like big fundamentals, right? And then obviously, I think the devil's in the details. You've got to improve a million small little things about the way that you're playing the game, from the way that you're moving to the way that you're auto-attacking, and obviously everything in general. And obviously that just gets easier the fewer champions you focus on learning. So I hope that this kind of more general advice helps people to know what to focus on when you're working on climbing and learning League for the first time. With that being said, good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.